Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
We welcome you to the third week of our four-week series entitled Second Century of North Idaho. Once again, I would like to thank the North Idaho College Convocation Series for providing us these guests. We're most grateful if all they're on campus speaking to the student body to have them on our program. Our guest today is Lawrence Aripia, who has been with us today on campus, and he is a member of the Coeur d'Alene Indian tribe. He is not only a member of the tribe, but he is a member and secretary of the Tribal Council. In addition to that, he's an artist, and one of his many accomplishments was to design the centennial coin for the celebration of the 100 years of Idaho. He has been a co-instructor of the Indian Art Institute at Santa Fe, New Mexico. In addition to that, he designed and produced the ABC coloring book that is used at the tribal schools. His accomplishments go on in many, many other areas, and he's been here with us today on campus and again on this program to discuss the Preblack robe spirituality of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Lawrence, it's such a special privilege to have you on our program.
Thank you.
I'm very happy to have on the program, on the panel, Steve Shink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at Federal College, and I shall invite Steve to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Aripia, maybe it would be helpful for our audience if you could set the stage for our further discussions by telling us a little bit about the history of the Coeur d'Alene tribe.
All right. It's kind of hard to recall history because it's actually broken into two parts. Like when we ever ask a question about our history, it's always divided into two parts. Was that before or after the coming of the black robe? The black robe changed our entire lifestyle, and it changed everything about the way of life of the Coeur d'Alene people. And so the history before the coming of the black robe is clear to us through stories and legends that were told to us, you know. But as far as our the spirituality and the different prayers, the ceremonies that they had before the black robe, a lot of them are lost. In fact, practically all of them are lost because it was forbidden for us to practice any of those ceremonies after the coming of the black robe.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what you mean when you say the coming of the black robe?
Well, the legend or the stories go that about 200 years before the coming of the white man, an old chief by the name of Circling Raven had a vision of a man coming among us who would bring us the truth and would lead us in our quest for being good and other things that, you know, to help the tribe. So we actually waited probably a couple hundred years for the arrival of a man dressed in black with the black robe, white hair, and wearing crossed sticks, which is the cross. And so this was a vision that was supposed to have been had by Circling Raven many years before. So when Father D. Smith arrived in 1842, well, he had the white hair, he had the cross sticks and the black robe, and so the entire tribe switched or became Catholic. And the chief at that time was Vincent, or Stalam, the Indian name for him, and he instructed all of the people to become Catholic. And so it was very significant in our history because that's where the big change come. Before the coming of the black robe, we gained stature in the social way by stealing horses from our enemies, from the Nez Perce or from the Crow or tribes, and so this was the way that they climbed on a social ladder. If you stole 10 horses from an enemy, well, you were considered a great man, and you received wealth, and you also gave whatever wealth you had. And so after the coming of the black robe and the religion, well, it was then a crime and a sin to steal a horse. And we didn't look at it as stealing. We looked at it as a way of becoming a better man and a better person among your peers.
Now, prior to the coming of the black robe, were the traditions of the pre-black robe spirituality of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, were they passed along orally from generation to generation?
Yes, mostly in stories and legends, of course. Many of the stories, well, all of the stories had a moral to it, and it helped in their everyday life morally, and it helped them to honor each other, and all the stories covered all of the different problems or problem areas that was common to the Indian people at that time. So it was very, very important to have the stories, and some of them were comical, but they all had a story or an example to show for each story.
You've already mentioned how the coming of the black robe changed one important tradition of the tribe, stealing horses from other tribes in the region.
Yes.
What other impact did that event have on the day-to-day life of members of your tribe?
Well, that was probably that took away all of our old traditions, the way of worshiping and the way of everyday life, and our war parties. We no longer had war leaders, or they could not become war leaders or hunting leaders. These were considered very important men because they knew where the game was, and they knew how to make war and all of these things. And so those important positions among our people were lost in. We no longer needed the war chiefs or the head men who led the war parties and hunting expeditions.
Were similar changes taking place in other tribes in the region?
Yes, and throughout. In fact, the first major change came about, I believe, when the introduction of the horse, which is many years before the first white man came in the area. By having the horse, we were able to travel clear into South Dakota and Montana for hunting the buffalo, and that was something we had never done before. And as a result of going back there, we adopted a lot of the things that were done by the Plains Indians. I gave the example this morning of the teepee. The skin teepee. We never had that until it was introduced from the plains, and then the type of shelter that we had was about the same as the teepee, but it was covered with tule mats and other grass mats that were made by the people, and so then they also lived in cave areas. They had like log houses built half into the ground, and then they had just the pole houses. So the the teepee was actually brought from the Plains people, and there were other things. Even they were beginning to catch on to the ghost dances and the snake dances or whatever else the Plains people did, which we never did, because what we worshipped or how we prayed just concerned the animals mostly and the plants around us here. So it was a big change, and I believe that if it hadn't have been for the interference or the arrival of the Catholic priest, we would have gone into those different ceremonies also.
Lawrence, you did a really wonderful job today with the campus talking about the deep commitment and belief of members of the tribe to not only their family but to their neighbors. And I have a two-part question I'd like to ask. First of all, I would really appreciate if you might share with our audience one of the prayers, I think, that really illustrate how you believed in living and how you related to the neighbor. And then if you'd just explain that to us about, I was very impressed about how you feel that one has an obligation to their neighbor as they have to themselves.
Yes. Well, I believe that by this obligation that they had for one another, for the neighbor, and for reflected back onto themselves as far as their behavior was concerned. They had the idea inside of them, if I treat my neighbor as I would treat myself, then we will be in harmony with each other. And when this was accomplished, it made him feel good, it made you feel good. And I think through that process, we were spiritually entwined with each other, you know. And so the prayers that they made, I tried to make an example of it this morning when I began my program. In the mornings, he would wake up, and the first thing he would do would call upon a motrin, which is translated means he who sits on top of everything. And this, in our way of thinking, I guess at that time, would be God. Actually, although we didn't know him as God, or we didn't know anything about God as we see him now, but we knew that there was a being there, a person that, or a being that looked down upon all of us. And if he wasn't pleased through the animals or through or what we call Sumesh, the entity that we had as a personal guide, or something that we tried to imitate during our lifetime. Like if I went out on a vision quest and had a vision of, let's say, an owl. Well, an owl would become my Sumesh, and I would have to imitate the way an owl would think, the way an owl acts, how he would help his fellow creatures. And so we would pray to a motrin through the Sumesh, or the animal or being that we have been appointed to, or whatever. And so this guided our behavior, our devotion, I guess you would say, to our Sumesh, and then to the Amotrin, the one who sits above everything. Through our devotion, we would live a life that would, what we consider the straight and narrow now, but it would be a life that would please ourselves, our neighbors, and be a good omen for the people around us. probably the most important thing that the Indian felt was to be of help and to be part of the neighbor, people around him, and that was the main purpose of their being. And through that they hunted together. They gathered roots and herbs together, and everything was for one another. And if you ever got out of line and became selfish, then you were not only hurting yourself, but you were hurting those around you and those that thought of you and respected you. You lost the respect of your neighbor, and that was probably the worst thing that could happen, is to lose the respect of your neighbor.
It's a real contrast to modern times of in lots of places in the world where we find a lot of individuals who are homeless, for example, in the streets of New York and Chicago. From the spiritual and philosophical life that the Coeur d'Alene tribe lived, if one was alone and one got ill and so forth, that person would really be taken care of. No one had to ever feel that they were alone or insecure.
No, they were always taken care of. I was asked this morning what happened to the elderly once they were unable to help. Well, they were never left alone or helpless, because they were considered very useful to shape the lives of the younger ones, and so they were never abandoned, and they were always looked at with respect, and they were always trying to get the knowledge from these old people so that it would help them as they go through life. So I don't believe that any of the Indians could be called homeless or would be abandoned. In some tribes, I guess, well, I understand the Eskimo, once they would get to a certain age, then they were left alone, but the people asked for it because they felt that they were a burden on everybody, slowing everybody down. But it never occurred here, because an older person was never considered useless. They were always more or less milked for their wisdom and for their knowledge and how to take care of each other.
Thank you. Steve Sheen.
What concept what role did the concept of an afterlife play in the pre-Black Robe spirituality of the tribe?
I believe that they just felt that it was just a continuation of the life they lived on earth. After death, they kept on going. They couldn't come back and help in a physical way, but they could guide whoever their people, but they would watch over them. There was like stepping over into another life, or a continuation of another life.
Was that afterlife in any way connected with the way you behaved? For instance, you mentioned how important it was to have the respect of your neighbors. If you lost that respect for some reason, did that...
Then you were condemned. If you died without the respect of your people or your neighbors, then you were considered lost, and you would wander, and you would always be one of the lost animals, one of the animals that can't think, that can't take care of himself, that is just lost. Then you were no good to anybody.
You mentioned that after the coming of Father de Smet, after the Black Robe arrived, that the conversion was complete for the tribe. Mm-hmm. Were some vestiges of pre-Black Robe spirituality carried over? Did those early beliefs affect the way the tribe looked at this new religion? Yes,
I believe it was told to me that more of the Indian people looked to the Catholic religion more than any other, and they believe it was mostly because of the color. The mass itself is almost like a stage production, like they dress in vestments, and then they go through rituals, and I think the Indian people kind of looked at it as the same as their dances and their rituals, and so and then the idea of God coming to you in the form of communion and wine. The mystery of it, I believe, was just about the same kind of mystery that we had for Amotkan, he who sits above everything. So that it just like it was a carryover, only a different way, different concept, different beliefs. But I think that our people just went into it just naturally, and once they learned the prayers and they learned the catechism, and it just became a part of them. In fact, that many of the older people were very religious. They stuck to the Catholic rituals to a T. They were right in there, and now that is all disappearing. We have people that are leaving the church, and so we are looking out in different directions now. Some of the people have returned to the Native American church and the Seven Drums religion, and so they are going back, trying to go back to the Native church.
Lawrence, part of your religion and part of the culture itself has been another very, very positive aspect, and that is your great appreciation for nature and for the environment and for the earth. Would you share with our viewers a little more insight to what I'm attempting to ask here, and that is, what is that belief concerning how we should treat the earth that we're on and the environment around us?
Well, I think the main thing is that they believe that there is no way that you could own part of Mother Earth. That is where we came from. We were part of the earth at one time, and then we, although some of the stories, the coyote stories of the creation of man tell of the coyote distributing parts, which ended up being the different tribes throughout the Northwest. But the other side of it is that we believed that we came from the animals. The animals were the first creatures that were made by Amotkan, and some of them did things that were against each other. It might have been greed, or it might have been selfishness, or they did something to each other, and as a punishment, they were put lower in the what would you call it? The steps of evolution, I guess. But we didn't look at it as evolution. But I guess that would be part of it. When you did something that offended the other animals, then Amotkan would put you in a lower position, and then all of a sudden, as the animals were lowered in different areas, one being kept coming up until he became man, and he was given a heart and a mind, and so that he was able to be above all animals. But the animals and the earth is where he come from, and without the animals he would not be able to live, and without the earth he would not be able to live, without the bitter roots, without the different plants. So he had to respect the animals and the plants, because after all, this is where he came from. And he would not continue on this earth if he offends a Motkin, or if he offends the animals who he is part of. And so the earth being his mother, he couldn't own it. He couldn't sell it. He couldn't. He could borrow it, but he couldn't own it. And so when the white man came, and then all of a sudden he started putting acres and dividing the land up into sections and so forth, into states and so on. It was unbelievable to the Indian. How could they do this to Mother Earth? You don't own Mother Earth. Nobody does. We could borrow Mother Earth, but we can't own her. So this was one of the beliefs that they had, and I believe that was one of the reasons it was so easy for us to let our lands and our homeland go, you know. So, but there's a lot of things, I believe, that from this concept of being part of Mother Earth and being part of the animal world, it made us have an idea or the way of thinking that we are poor as far as being able to think or to be able to do different things. Almost every treaty and every dealing that the Indians had with the United States government, you see in there where the chief would get up and he would immediately say, I am only a poor Indian. I am only a poor Indian. Do with me what you want. And so they said it so much, I guess, that they actually believed it. And so they really felt inferior to the white man at that time. So they just let everything go.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, but I want to thank you on behalf of Steve and our staff. It's been most informative. You've been very fine and cooperative and wonderful to be with us today here and all day on campus. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Our guest has been Lawrence Aripier, who is a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe and is the secretary to the Tribal Council. Hope you've enjoyed this program. I want to invite you to be with us again next week when we will continue this series on the 2nd century of North Idaho. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.